Okay, uh, howdy, comparative politics. You've done your midterms. Now it's on to the rest of the semester, chapters 5 through 11. We're putting chapters 5 and 8 together. You should have already read those, and I'm behind, so I'm sure you've already read them. They're both on democracies, and I'm going to deal with those together in the next few video snippets, which I'll be posting over the next couple of days. So, democracy, this is well timed because we got this big, huge election coming up. Everybody says it's the most important election in their lifetimes. I feel that way, and I've been around the block, been paying attention to politics for a long time, and I would say that that's about right. This probably is the most important election in our lifetimes. So this is well timed, and by the time we finish these two chapters, the election will have taken place, and hopefully I can do a snippet or two that discusses in some detail certain aspects of the election as it's happening or shortly after it's finished. But first, I want to set the whole thing up. Chapters 5 and 8 are both about democracies. Democracies for Chapter 5. Chapter 8 is advanced democracies. But I deal with them together. There's a lot of overlap there. What is it? Obviously, that's where you have to start. And I think, like a lot of these terms, once again, we know what it is, right? Normal people know what democracy is. But then again, do we really? Let's make sure we're on the same page here. One thing that you hear a lot is that the U.S. isn't a democracy, right? We're not a democracy, we're a republic. Well, that's true. But from a functional perspective, that's true for all democracies worldwide. When comparativists, political scientists more generally talk about democracy, they're talking about the general definition, which 100% includes the United States of America, even though we all don't go down to the town hall and vote directly on issues. So, what are we going to do for a more specific understanding of what it is? The book has a perfectly good definition. A democracy, democracy is political power exercised either directly or indirectly through participation, competition, and liberty. All right, there's some important stuff going on there. I want to break it down a little bit. First of all, the biggest thing is the mention of the inclusion of direct and indirect. So, the most of the democracy that happens in the United States is of the indirect type. Direct democracy is where people vote directly on issues, and we do have some of that. And other countries around the world have some of that. What most of it is indirect, and that means what you do, what that involves is citizens vote for representatives who then do the actual voting on all the issues. That's indirect. And that's what everybody around the world practices. It's 95% of what's called democracies these days is indirect. Now, for the three factors, you have to have all three: participation, competition, and liberty. Otherwise, we're not going to consider you a democracy. How much of each one of those do you have? Well, that's entirely up for discussion. And if you're nerdy and into these sort of things, it makes for some pretty good, interesting discussions. How much of each one of those things is enough? Participation, just think of that as the voting. Candidates are able to participate freely enough, and people are able to choose them. They're able to select them through voting in one way or another, right? That's participation. Liberty. Well, it's that freedom, but not just the freedom of the people to run and to vote, but to stand up in the middle of the street and profess who you support, to meet in groups of any particular size to express your support, to buy advertisements on television stations, etc. That's the liberty aspect. And then competition. Communist states were infamous for having elections. They all called themselves democratic, and they did hold elections, but there was never more than one functioning party. And if you voted for anybody other than the Communist Party, you could find yourself in a lot of trouble. So that's what we're talking about with competition there. And one thing, here's another opportunity to mention that a lot of times things can be either categorical or there can be a lot of gray areas. So with democracy, there's a lot of gray areas. And it's important to recognize that. How democratic is Russia? Well, they're certainly less democratic than the United States. They're more democratic than Saudi Arabia, right? And the differences are important. We probably wouldn't call Russia a true democracy in any sense, but there's some area of gray there. Also, we can view it categorically, yes or no. That can be useful. And this is one of the things that political scientists and comparativists will do is decide whether or not they want to say something is a democracy or is not a democracy, or whether or not they want to have some kind of slight scale, right? And this is where you'll see things like a 1 through 10 scale. So that's something to keep in mind, that sometimes there's a temptation to say yes or no, and there's advantages to yes or no, this is a democracy, this isn't. But there's also, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of times there may be a lot of disagreement over what country is a democracy and what's not. So that's the definitional stuff. Now let's get to something that's a little bit juicier. One of the big picture questions I want to look at, and that'll be the next few minutes of this first snippet, is it good? Does it work? And this is a very open question. Let's look at it from the standpoint of political attitudes, which I've just tested you on in the exam. That's the linear scale from left to right, radicals, liberals, conservatives, reactionaries. It's how you feel about change. Well, this is a discussion that's all about political attitudes. Okay. On the far left, you have radicals. They have always been skeptical of democracy and quite willing to replace it with something new and improved and better and fundamentally different. From the left, the critiques of democracy are that, well, democracy is never that democratic. The U.S. invented the modern form of democracy, but as we all know, it was only applicable to a very small percentage of the population voting and participating. In the beginning, just white males with land, and it's gradually expanded. It's taken a very, very long time to increase the franchise, and it's still very questionable. The United States democracy and democracies around the world remain extremely imperfect. So from the left, there's a view that democracy is just sort of it's there basically to support other things, to keep people in power, to keep, in the United States you'll hear the critique in other countries, that it's there to maintain the power and privilege of white Americans, or maybe it's white males more specifically, maybe it's just males generally, a very specific feminist critique. Neo-Marxist critiques from the left are going to be that it's there to prop up capitalism. And that would help to explain why, over such a long period of time, it's been so imperfect and so difficult to alter. So that's from the left. Now the opposite perspective from the right, reactionary, remember this? Well, conservatives and reactionaries have always been opposed to democracy. And they remain opposed to democracy in theory, in its purest form. Conservatives and reactionaries have always supported limiting the franchise to particular groups of people, usually those that already hold power. That's true across time. So reactionaries and conservatives have always been opposed to democracy and are always openly on the record in support of the idea that not everybody should vote. So those are critiques from both the left and the right. Let me give you a very short pro-democracy case. We'll end the snippet there. We'll come back to it later. What do we know? What can we say about democracy that in support of it? That what can we say with confidence? Democracy is highly correlated with a lot of really good stuff. So being a democracy as opposed to a theocracy, for example, or a communist state is preferable if your only evidence are data and results for a whole bunch of different categories. So the positive correlations, that means the more democratic you are as a state, the higher wealth you have, the higher income you have, the more freedom you have, the less corruption you have. All kinds of good stuff are highly correlated with being a democracy. So keep in mind when you hear critiques about democracy, many of which are fair, some of which I fully agree with, always keep in mind, on the other hand, democracies do perform better than the alternatives that are apparently available. All right. Let's talk about two other things that are closely related, kind of subsets, but they're interesting and really important. Democracies don't fight each other. This is for an international relations class, and it's called the democratic peace theory. And it's depending on how you define fight and how you define democracy, it's basically true. Democratic countries never fight each other. Along the same lines, or for the same reasons, democratic countries never experience famines. Never. Does not happen. It depends a little on the definitions of what you're calling a democratic country and what you're calling a famine, but basically that never happens. Democracies never fight each other. Democracies fight non-democracies all the time, but democracies never fight each other, and democracies never experience famine. Why not? Kind of the most popular explanation for this is the obvious one, that democratic leaders are responsible to the people. So if you engage in a war with another country and this is the answer for the famine question. If there's a famine in your country and it's on your watch, in a democracy, you are not going to survive that democratically. You will lose. So there's just way too much at risk for a democratic leader to allow a famine to happen, which is not the case in non-democracies. Famines are survivable sometimes under a non-democratic regime type. Now, why it's a little bit different for why democracies don't fight each other. We're too closely related to each other. We're interdependent. Usually there's a lot of economic commerce involved with each other. There's a lot of trade. So it does you both harm. And then in addition to that, you're responsible to the people. So that's the primary theory for why democracies don't experience famines and why democracies don't fight each other. And these are important points to keep in mind when you're going through angst over the next 144 hours and thereafter at the state of this country, or maybe you're looking around the world and seeing whatever mess it happens to be in whatever democratic country and wondering, is there an alternative? Keep in mind that democracies have a lot going for them, everything else equal. All right, I'll leave it there, and I will see you next up for the next snippet on democracies.